the Golden Road.
So this is not about the Indian century, it's about the Indian millennium, stretching from around 250 BC to 1200 AD, when India was the center of the world. Think, first of all, look at this extraordinary image which just turned up in an archaeological excavation in Egypt. You can see very clearly that it's the Buddha's head. But everything else about this extraordinary sculpture is surprising. The marble is carved from marble in what is now Turkey, from Proconnesian marble in the Marmara Sea. It was constructed, we can tell from the drills, in Alexandria on the Mediterranean shore of Egypt. And it was found in an Isis temple on the shores of the Red Sea, at the port, Berenike, where generations of Indian sailors and entire fleets of Indian merchants used to land to bring their goods to the Roman Empire. It seems extraordinary that a Buddha would turn up in Egypt, but it should not be so when you consider that just as the Buddha's head is found in Egypt 6,000 miles to the west of India, so Angkor Wat, 5,000 miles to the east of India, is entirely an Indian planned project. In the galleries of Angkor Wat, you see the Battle of Kurukshetra, the Battle of Lanka, images of Krishna and his gopis, inspired by stories first told in the area here around Delhi. Why is this not better known? Why is it a surprise that India dominated Asia for as much as 1,000 years? Partly the story is clearly about colonialism, about the way that Macaulay and others like him said that a single shelf of good English books was worth the entire native literature of India and Arabia. But I think there are other factors too. Look here at this map, which people continue to reproduce in map after map, book after book, of what is said to be the Silk Road. We are told that the principal trade east-west in ancient times was this single line which ran from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea. Even its modern edition, which is called the Maritime Silk Road, which is the dotted line which runs down from Guangzhou through the Malacca Straits, bypasses India. The line just dots around the peninsula. It's the contention in this book I've just written, The Golden Road, that this is an entirely false premise. Memorize for a moment this map and the route it takes and compare it with the actual shape of Roman trade with India, which is revealed by a new map put out by Oxford University this year. Here is a map of Roman coin hoards discovered by archaeologists. As you'd imagine, the center is Gaul, Spain, Greece, Italy, southern England, tapering off as you go northwards into Scandinavia and Germany. There's a lot of coins around the Mediterranean, a little tail down the Nile, a couple in Yemen, and a scattering in what's now Afghanistan. But look at India in the bottom right-hand corner. India is dotted with Roman coin hoards. In fact, it's now clear that India was the principal trading partner of India. India and Rome were the principal trading partners of each other in the early millennia BC. This book takes three big Indian ideas which traveled around the world. And the first, and in many ways the most successful export of ideas which India oversaw, was the spread of Buddhism. Out of the Gangetic Plains, in the mid-5th century BCE, then projected even further by the soft power of Ashoka. Ashoka in 250 BC converts to Buddhism, and in his reign, you see missionaries being sent out far afield, as far as Cyrene, which is modern Libya. You also see Buddhism spreading southwards. It's at this period that you see the first Buddhist monasteries in the Deccan, the famous and utterly beautiful Padmapani from Ajanta. You see the first Buddhist monasteries. This is Bhaja in about 150 BC, cut out of a rock face, cut out of living rock, but showing the exact lineaments of the bamboo and wooden architecture, which we have now lost. This is dated 150 BCE. Then Ashoka sends his son Mahinda to Sri Lanka, and after preaching outside Anuradhapura for a week, the great stupas of Anuradhapura begin to be constructed, and we have recently discovered on the hilltop of Rajagala in central Sri Lanka the original stupa of Mahinda, with his name in Brahmi script on this very crude, very, very early stupa, one of the very first outside India, if not the first. In time, Sri Lanka becomes the center of Buddhist activity, and you see the projection of Indian ideas through Buddhism out across the oceans, out to Burma, to Thailand, to Malaysia. And by 100 AD, India is locked with Rome in a very regular trading relationship. The geographer Strabo talks about a fleet of 250 trading vessels waiting in the Red Sea at Myas Hormuz, at the top of the Red Sea. You can see the place here, waiting to sail to Sri Lanka. Pliny, the historian, talks about the astonishing drain of gold from Roman pockets into those of India. And in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is like the Lonely Planet or the Rough Guide of these centuries, there is a great intimacy. The Romans know every port on the west coast of India. They're particularly focused on Muziris in what's now Kerala, on Barigaza in what is now Gujarat, and on the mouth of the Indus. And it's not just the Romans and the Indians who are training. There are Ethiopians. Here are images from Amaravati of these extraordinary, handsome Ethiopian envoys turning up with gifts at the court of some Indian ruler. And we know the figures. The Muziris papyrus, which is a new discovery, gives the detail of one cargo. It's a shipping invoice taken out by a shipper in Alexandria about a single container that he was going to place in 150 AD for a ruler for a merchant in Alexandria. He was going to send 10 tons of ivory, pepper, spices, a thing called nard, which was used in perfume. And what's extraordinary about this document is it reveals the actual values of these objects. It shows that how much the Romans were prepared to pay for ivory and for pepper and for the other great exports of India. In fact, the figures are so enormous that scholars now believe that maybe as much as 1/3 of the total Roman imperial budget was paid for by the customs take at Berenike when these goods entered the Roman Empire. And so you have this figure of India being the principal trading partner of the Roman Empire, not China. And these are the goods that were traded from India. This mosaic is probably from the villa of a merchant who engaged in trade with India. And he has this figure, this personification of India in the center, taken from an image of a yakshi. She's got expensive silk around her knees. She's got pepper on a tree behind her. She's holding ivory, which is probably the single most lucrative export to Rome. Circus animals, tigers and elephants, rather like the rhinoceros we're apparently going to see in Gladiator 2 next month. And behind the tiger is something called malabathrum, which is used in perfumery. So these were expensive luxury items. And the Romans couldn't get enough of these Indian products. And this is what the sort of figure we're talking about. The Yakshi holding onto a tree. This is the same figure that we get in that wonderful mosaic in Sicily. And if you look in excavations now, you're finding increasing numbers of expensive luxury Indian goods, such as this ivory Yakshi, turning up in excavations in Europe. This is a Yakshi from Pompeii. But you also find Roman objects shipping to India. So these are Egyptian glass beakers, the Pharos lighthouse in the center, the grape harvest, the Gladiator. This was found under the American Air Force Base in Bagram, brought by a Roman-Egyptian ship to the mouth of the Indus, punted up the Indus and the Kabul River. And so that's why you see amazing parallels between the art of Central Asia and the art of Egypt. An image of the Buddha and his disciples at the top from Miran, now in the National Museum here, and a Coptic papyrus below. And it is from the Roman world that we get the figure of the Buddha, first changing from a symbol, like a pair of feet or an empty turban, into this figure on the Bimaran reliquary. And it is these very Roman faces that owe so much to the art of Rome that we see the drapery of the bodhisattvas in Gandharan art. So India was not in any way peripheral to the made trade networks in ancient Asia. This myth of the Silk Road has made India seem more peripheral than it actually was. In reality, we now know from solid scholarship and from archaeology that India lay at the heart of the ancient world. And Indian ideas were soon being transmitted through Afghanistan, through Bamiyan, to China, where by the 2nd and 3rd century we find the Buddha taking on the physiognomy of China. Originally, Buddhism is just a religion brought by traders into China. But by the 5th and 6th century, you find Gupta sculptures being copied by the Chinese all over Gansu and beginning to head further eastwards into the heartlands of China. These extraordinary, very Indian-looking deities and apsaras and Gandharvas floating over the Buddhist temples of China tell a story of Indian art having more and more influence, Indian ideas heading closer and closer to the Chinese court until it actually reaches Chang'an, and Buddhism becomes a minority religion alongside Taoism and alongside Confucianism. But the big breakthrough happens when this man on the right, Xuanzang, the Chinese traveling monk, leaves his monastery in eastern China, travels the length of the deserts of the Gobi and the Taklamakan, crosses the Pamirs, and comes to Nalanda University. Nalanda, which was then the Oxbridge, the Ivy League, the NASA of ancient Asia, visited not just by monks from China, but monks from Nepal, from Korea, and Japan. Xuanzang particularly came for the library in Nalanda. He says that the library is this extraordinary resource, 9 stories high, full not just of Buddhist texts, but the Vedas, science, mathematics, the works of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta, the works of astronomy. Everything was gathered in this extraordinary space. And in particular, look on the left at the plan of the different monasteries and university buildings in Nalanda. It's the same as we find in Oxbridge. A courtyard, a cloister walk, and then the rooms of scholars leading off in four sides. This plan passes from the Buddhist Mahaviharas like Nalanda into the madrasas of medieval Islam, and ultimately ends up in Oxford and Cambridge, where you see the same plan being used throughout the Middle Ages. Xuanzang can't believe his luck. For 20 years, he travels and studies and gathers the learning of India at Nalanda. And then he takes it back to China. 11 camel caravans full of manuscripts pass from Nalanda all the way back to Chang'an, where an entire pagoda, the Wild Goose Pagoda, is built to house them. We have still the copper plate that shows the founding of an expatriate monastery at Nalanda by the king of Srivijaya, the king of Sumatra. So we've got this huge international flow of students from the rest of Asia to India, recognizing India as the center not only of trade and the economy, but of learning, science, and philosophy. But the person who makes the difference in China is this extraordinary woman, Wu Zetian. She's only 15 years old when Xuanzang comes back with all his manuscripts, and she's part of the harem of Taizong on the left there. But she eventually marries Gaizong on the right, and this woman, who's the subject of a 250-part Chinese soap opera, eventually becomes the only woman emperor in 3,000 years of Chinese dynastic history. And she pulls this off with a Mahayana Buddhist coup d'etat led by intellectuals from Nalanda. For one reign, Nalanda-trained Buddhists take over the court in China, and Wu Zetian makes Buddhism the court religion. In the undercarriage, if you like, of Buddhism comes all the learning of India, the astronomy, the mathematics, the technology for sugarcane, and so on. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, Indian trading guilds have moved now eastwards. Rome has fallen in the 5th century. There is no more gold coming in from Rome, and the Tamil trading guilds pivot towards what they call Savarna Bhumi, the lands of gold. And it's in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries that you begin to see first wooden images of the Buddha, then small handheld images of Vishnu, and then finally vast Shiva lingams appearing all over Southeast Asia, and with it the Sanskrit language. Ships like this sail across the Bay of Bengal and arrive in the Mekong Delta, where Indic-style cities using Sanskrit from the 6th and 7th centuries begin to be built. Along the canals of the Mekong, you follow them and you end up at Angkor Baray, where there's the first Hindu temple in Southeast Asia at a place called Ashram Rosé on the hill of Angkor Baray. Inside that are these extraordinary Krishna statues. But what's interesting is that from the beginning, these statues have the physiognomy of Khmers. They're wearing Khmer clothes. So it's not a copy of what's going on in India. People in Southeast Asia take what they admire of Indian culture. It's not a conquest by the sword. It's an attraction of soft power. Indian soft power is so powerful that everyone wants a bit of it. And just as China takes on Buddhism, so you find Hindu kingship spreading throughout Southeast Asia, in Thailand, in particularly Cambodia, in Java and the rest of Indonesia. And by the 7th or 8th centuries, you have Sanskrit as the language of both diplomacy and culture, all the way from Kandahar to Bali. But again, it's slightly different from India. This is a picture of Jayavarman II, the founder of the Angkor dynasty, and he is depicting himself as Lord Vishnu. All over Southeast Asia, Brahmins are turning up, performing Abhisheka ceremonies, and renaming the rulers of Southeast Asia with Sanskrit titles. Suddenly, they are Suryavarman, Mahendravarman. The Pallava Grantha script of South India is now the basis for every single Southeast Asian script: Khmer, Pew, Mon, Thai, and so on. You even find the sacralization of the rivers and the landscape of Southeast Asia. Shiva lingams and yonis are sculpted into the riverbed, turning the main river of Southeast Asia into the Mekong, which is merely the Khmer pronunciation of Ma Ganga. So a new Kurukshetra rises in Laos, a new Ayodhya rises outside Bangkok, and a new Ganges flows through the center of it. India is expanding itself into Southeast Asia. A temple at Mahabalipuram on the left is built in almost identical form in Gedong Songo in Java just 5 years later. Images of the Ramayana rise outside Prambanan. And these grow to be larger and bigger than the temples of India, because the states in Southeast Asia, the Khmer Empire and Srivijaya, are larger too. So Borobudur, the most sophisticated monastery in Southeast Asia, and famously Angkor Wat, the largest Hindu temple in the world, in Cambodia, not in India. But finally, one last gift, 0, and the numbers we all use. Invented in Gupta India at the time of Chandragupta II, passed by them on through Gwalior and through early inscriptions in northern India to the Arab world. Here's the map we should all know in our schools. It's the numbers we all use today, and 0, pass from Brahmi to the Gwalior inscription I just showed you, and then inform modern Devanagari, the Arabic script still in use in Saudi Arabia and Iraq, and the Western Arabic numbers formed in Morocco and Spain, which become the modern European numbers today. In Europe and America, we call them Arabic numbers because the Europeans got them from the Arabs, but the Arabs got them from India. They pass through the Barmakids, who were previously Buddhist abbots in Afghanistan. They convert to Islam, take over as viziers in Baghdad, and then they send to India for the works of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta, which turn up in the 770s. These spread through the Arab world via the translations of Al-Khwarizmi, who writes a book called the Compendious Book of Calculating by Completion and Balancing According to Hindu Calculation. That book is known simply as Al-Jabr, from which we get the word algebra. The name of the translator, Al-Khwarizmi, gives us our word algorithm, but all are rooted in the learning of ancient India. And along with chess, these ideas pass in Al-Khwarizmi's version across the Arab world. On the right of the picture, you've got Sindh, where the copies of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta are brought from. They arrive in Baghdad in the center of the map, if I can get the pointer here, and then they pass all the way up to Spain by the 10th century. But it is this young man, Fibonacci, who brings it to Italy. Fibonacci is brought up in Algeria, and he uses the Arabic numbers, but he knows that they are in the invention of here is Algeria on the left of the map. You can see Pisa at the top of Italy. He knows they are the invention of the Indians, and he calls them the 9 figures of the Indians and the extraordinary 0 through which any number up to infinity can be expressed. And Fibonacci goes back to Italy, where they're still doing long multiplication using Roman numbers, MCMVVX times XVVVV, and he explains how to calculate in what he calls the modus Indorum, the Indian method. And it's through Fibonacci's fame and the Liber Abaci that he writes that these numbers are taken up by the Emperor Frederick II, and a second edition is produced, which includes money lending, usury, the interest rates, the Indian method of accounting, and these different forms of Indian learning pass through Italy, inspiring the rise of the Medici banks, and ultimately the rise of European finance and companies such as the East India Company. So you can argue that the East India Company is using Indian weapons, Indian innovations against India. But the East India Company is another story for another day. Thank you very much for that quick canter.